What's that? Hi, this is Bevan from NGA, and we're just going to wait a few minutes until a few more people log on. I think people are just logging on right now. So I'm just going to mute everybody and we'll start in a minute or two. Hello, everybody, and welcome to NGA and the Water Policy Learning Network. Thanks for joining this webinar today, Water 101 for New Policy Advisors. It's hosted by the National Governor Association's Water Policy Learning Network, and we operate under NGA Solutions, the Center for Best Practices. I'm Bevan Bucheister, a Senior Policy Analyst at NGA, and I lead the Water Policy Learning Network. I just wanted to first give you, welcome you to NGA. And since there are 22 new governors this year, and that means 22 new governors, water policy advisors, wanted to give you a little background on NGA before we begin. The Water Policy Learning Network is co-chaired by Governor Hogan of Maryland and Governor Inslee of Washington, and that's a new announcement. He's our new co-chair. Governor Brown of California was our former co-chair. We are a nonpartisan organization. Our role is to offer information and education on best practices. We have several different divisions: education, economic opportunity, health, homeland security, and public safety. And I'm with the energy, environment, and infrastructure division. So our role is to provide answers to your water policy questions in the form of technical assistance memos. We also have annual meetings and webinars like this and state retreats. And we rely on a broad group of advisors to help find best practices and the answers that you pose to us. So if we don't know it, we reach out to our advisory group, which is co-chaired by Secretary of Environment for Maryland, Ben Grumbles, who's one of our speakers today, and Rob Duff, who is in the governor's office, Governor Inslee's office in Washington State. Our advisory group also includes the U.S. Water Alliance, American Water Works Association, American Farmland Trust, River Network, American Water, Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, and Alan Robertson, who's the director, will be our speaker today. Our other speaker today. Environmental Council of the States is also on our advisory group, Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and the Association of Clean Water Administrators. We'll be holding another webinar for new and also the seasoned advisors on the Clean Water Act and source water protection in the May-June timeframe, and we'll get that out to you a few weeks in advance. And we're holding an in-person meeting for all governors, water advisors in August in Annapolis, Maryland, where we hope to have Governor Hogan welcome everyone to Maryland and Annapolis. And just please note that NGA will fund your travel for this and your lodging. So we also want your input on topics you want to learn more about on future webinars and at our in-person meetings. So please just send me an email anytime that you have a good idea. And my contact information is on the last slide, and it should be on the invitation to the webinar, the email invitation. Before I introduce our speakers today, I just want to mention some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll be sent a link in a few days after the webinar, so you're welcome to share it with anybody you want to share it with. And we also want this to be an interactive conversation, so please ask questions. And we're going to take a Q&A after each speaker. And I'm not advancing. Okay, I am advancing. And so submitting questions, there should be a box on the right hand of your screen, and there's a little tab there for questions. And so you can just write your question in there, and we'll pose it to the speakers. You can also use this tab down below that says send privately if you don't want anybody to see, the question that you have asked. So now on to introducing our speakers. Both of our speakers today are experts in their field, and we're very lucky to have both of them serve on our advisory group. Ben Grumbles is the Maryland Secretary of the Environment, and he's been in that role since 2015. He has a long and distinguished career in water policy, and we're fortunate to have him as our co-chair of our advisory group. Prior to being the Secretary of Environment, he was president of the U.S. Water Alliance, a great nonprofit organization that educates the public on the value of water and the need for integrative and innovative solutions. He was also assistant administrator for water at US EPA. And prior to that, he was director of Arizona's Water Department of Environmental Quality. And he began his career as environmental counsel and senior staff member on Transportation Infrastructure Committee and Science Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives. And our second speaker is Alan Roberson, Executive Director of the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. Alan's going to give us a crash course on the basics of the Safe Drinking Water Act. He has over 27 years of experience in development of drinking water policy and federal drinking water regulations. He and his staff work closely with EPA and state and territorial drinking water agencies to develop and implement federal drinking water regulations. And he also coordinates with his members, who are the state drinking water administrators, to establish policy their policy direction on federal water regulatory and security and preparedness issues. And Alan is also on the board of the directors for Fairfax Water, which is the largest water system in Virginia. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben Grumbles to begin his presentation.
Hey, thanks, Bevan, and thanks everybody for joining Alan and me and for a discussion about water and governance and just some ideas to keep in mind. As Bevan mentioned, I'm really fortunate in that my background has allowed me to not only work at the federal level in Congress, working on some major national water laws and at the U.S. EPA, but also two states that have very different challenges and very different solutions, Arizona and Maryland. And so I have this little cartoon slide that doesn't convey a whole lot of facts or figures, but it does identify some of the obvious figures and stakeholders who are engaged in water, which is often a full body contact sport, and clearly the livelihood and often the Achilles heel of activities that are important to every single governor and every governor's administration. And so I'm going to spend just maybe 60 seconds identifying the obvious on this cartoon slide that has water at the center. You see water infrastructure at the up the left, and the users particularly for drinking water and wastewater, the faucet, the toilet, the pitcher. Water supply and water quality issues are often at the forefront. To the right of that, you have industry, factories, utilities, businesses involved in water quality and quantity. Water is our most precious liquid asset. From the perspective of businesses, oftentimes it's not energy, it's not labor, it's water that can be one of the most constricting forces or factors for the growth of an industry or new business. To the bottom, in the bottom left, is a cartoon example of the inextricable connection between food and water, as well as nutrients. And so some of the basic food groups, which often have very different needs and desires. And then at the bottom right corner, you have a great example of the energy-water nexus. It's tremendously important for each of you involved in water policy, water governance, for your governor to never lose sight of the connecting the dots and the drops and the watts, the energy-water nexus. So what I wanted to do is just highlight some of the basic points, and I apologize. This is very rudimentary, but every time water touches your inbox or your portfolio or issue platter, it's always obviously important to think, is this a water quantity issue? Is it a water quality issue? Is it a surface water issue or a groundwater issue? These differences between quantity and quality and between surface water and groundwater really inform policymakers' choices, regulators' discretion, stakeholders' perspectives, from property rights to use of regulatory tools or market-based solutions. But the quantity, quality, surface water, groundwater distinctions are tremendously important. The other major one, which you will hear very much so from the true expert, Alan Roberson, is water-related issues and solutions based on, is it ecology, fishable, swimmable, goals under the Clean Water Act, or is it public health, fit for drinking water purposes, for public contact exposure? Public health runs through all water issues to a large extent, but there are different infrastructures, different programs, such as under the Federal Clean Water Act and the State Clean Water Acts or statutes you have that focus as much on ecology as they do on public health. I would just state, in my years and being involved in water opportunities, water controversies, water emergencies, oftentimes those water issues that most directly relate to public health scream at the top, above the fold, the front page of the newspapers. So never lose sight of that obvious fact. Now, the other basic concept with these water issues that we all learn from one another on is, when you're looking at the range of water, quote unquote, water related issues in your state, your region, your watershed, you also it's real important to immediately think, well, who are the stakeholders who are most involved? Who are the regulators most involved or should be involved? Who are the policymakers, and what levels of government or governance should they be in, or are they in? As I've been learning over the years, sometimes in the hard way, there's a really big difference between water government and water governance. And so many multi-jurisdictional challenges within your own state or in your region will need to respect the governance, that sometimes it's not just a government who's involved in the regulation or the solution, but mechanisms like watershed organizations. It's not always about issuing providing a regulatory license. It's about establishing a social license to operate. That's really important for certain businesses. Just a couple other basics. As you get into this world of water policy from the state level, this is the same as the federal level. There's a difference between continued and long-standing challenges and emerging challenges. And you'll hear from Alan about both of those types. On the continued long-standing challenges, you know what they are, and you hear increasingly about them, but so often they embody the upstream, downstream policy debates. They involve how clean is clean, what level of standard is appropriate, what type of and degree of monitoring is needed. And fundamentally, they often involve jurisdictional upfront questions: which waters or activities fall within state regulation or state authority, or tribal or federal. The other big, long-standing challenges continues to be infrastructure. And as I've learned over the years, it's helpful to think about infrastructure in many different ways. The physical infrastructure is what I'm talking about mostly, not so much the data and the IT and governing infrastructure, but the physical infrastructure to that helps ensure that the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act laws in particular are in place, and that there are sufficient investments. And the National Governors Association highlights the challenges for the nation and for states on maintaining infrastructure, and particularly under the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and investing in the infrastructure to meet the needs currently and to be planning for the future needs and challenges. The physical infrastructure can be gray infrastructure, concrete. Under the Clean Water Act, that can be the brick and mortar wastewater treatment plants. It can be the drainage pipes, the storm conveyance systems. It can be a variety of mechanisms to manage water. Of course, in the water quantity world, there are all kinds of structures, infrastructure systems for reservoirs and pipes and maintenance systems to manage water. The other type of infrastructure besides the quote-unquote gray, which is not disparaging, it's a way to distinguish it from the green infrastructure, which over the last decade and a half has gotten more traction in a lot of states and disciplinary fields. And in reality, in the green infrastructure, you can define it in a micro level way and say it's the wetlands and bioswales and green roofs and rain gardens, natural softer path types of infrastructure solutions to manage a variety of water challenges, particularly in the stormwater arena. But green infrastructure can also be not just limited to the local and stormwater or wet weather flows management from sewer overflows, sanitary sewer overflows, and stormwater and runoff. It can be at the river basin level, and the green infrastructure, as Alan knows really well, with source water protection and protecting the forests, from forest to faucet types of initiatives. It's about forests and open space and a broader landscape to reduce pollution and also maintain flows. Those are examples of some of the long-standing and continuing challenges, emerging challenges, emerging opportunities, which often fly into your inbox and become really high-profile issues. There's always, how you define emerging is always, it's a subjective call, but you'll hear more about this. You already know about some of these emerging contaminants of concern. So when I was a EPA regulator, a decade ago, pharmaceuticals and personal care products really started to hit the national radar screen, the attention for gender bender chemicals of concern that were potentially causing synergistic effects on fish. And the big question about, what about with humans, and how to manage these pharmaceuticals and personal care products, PFOA and PFOS, the different types of chemicals involved in stain-resistant coatings and rubber film and aluminum cans, as you know, has really become one of the higher profile areas of concern emerging. And, need to find that balance between investing and researching and keeping your eyes and ears open and not diverting necessary resources away from proven existing contaminants of concern, pathogens, and some of the oldies but goodies that continue to persist. Now, let me just mention a few examples of approaches that states. Every governor's office needs to have some mechanism. Usually, it's a chief of staff who then says, "Well, I want a deputy chief of staff to cover transportation and commerce. I want a deputy chief of staff to cover environment, maybe natural resources. A deputy chief of staff to cover energy." They're really important mechanisms that have to be in place in the governor's office, so that water is not hopelessly siloed, because water doesn't respect political boundaries, and from a governor's administration standpoint, it also doesn't respect bureaucratic cubbyholes or silos. And so in Maryland, for instance, we have had for over a decade, the governor and actually previous governors have a cabinet that focuses specifically on the Chesapeake Bay. And this cabinet is well-staffed, high profile because of the importance of that to the state of Maryland and its economy. And that cabinet meets frequently, and it involves an agriculture secretary, a natural resources secretary, an environment secretary, the energy director, the transportation secretary, not just because of the ports involved, but also because of runoff from highways and infrastructure. Transportation infrastructure can be a hugely important part of the solution for different types of water issues, ranging from salt loadings to runoff from pavement that can have toxic contaminants. An example in Arizona that I am proud of in terms of bringing together the wide range of different players in a governor's cabinet was that we established back in 2009 a blue ribbon commission, which involved not just the governor's cabinet members, but some key stakeholders on water reuse. Again, reflecting that it's not the type of an issue like the Chesapeake Bay in Arizona. It's water availability and reuse and trying to move towards a fit-for-purpose standard. But I guess the basic point is, for anyone who's in the role of advising the governor, is that for water, you really need to spend some time getting to know the range of potential players, and that means not just members of the governor's cabinet, regulators and funders, but perhaps most importantly, the stakeholders and their interests, and recognize that some of these matters are uniquely reserved for the federal government, and others are very much in the wheelhouse of the state, or with some oversight by the state, but are really local issues. And typically, the work I've done over the years on septic systems, on-site management of waste when it comes to water, is usually a very much a local matter. It may be overseen by the county health officials, but it's really important to at least in Maryland, to have state oversight and state regulatory standards. In the interest of time, I think I'll stop there to say that's a really broad overview of water. I'll just simply say, as a state official, it's so encouraging that the National Governors Association has this type of convening mechanism, so that governors, aides, staff, officials can learn from one another on not just emerging issues, but also on some of the long-standing challenges that continue to be difficult but very important. And obviously, I'm biased on this, but I do believe, biased because of my years of working in water policy and water governance, that water, more than any other resource, is so inextricably connected to others, which, as Bevan and Alan know, I devoted 4 years of my life as the executive director of the U.S. Water Alliance and their mission, working closely with some really important trade associations and member associations under the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act around the country, was to move towards one water, integrated, sustainable water management that involves more of an emphasis on the conjunctive use between surface water and groundwater, and on the fact that yesterday's rainwater or flood event may be tomorrow's wastewater, and then the next day, with treatment and building public support, can be reused for various purposes. So one water is a really important theme. However, governors and their cabinets strive to coordinate, they need to think about integrated reuse strategies. It's a really growing theme for agriculture and for business and for economists who see tremendous waste and inefficiency if you're always treating water for drinking water purposes when so little of it is used for drinking water. So segregating and distinguishing what is the purpose of the water, and then you can put in place a smarter system, but you're always going to have to build public support and design safeguards so that public health and safety are always assured. Hey, thanks, Bevan and Alan. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Secretary Grumbles. I just wanted to ask you a question or two about, the fragmented authority of water in different departments in a state, government, and you mentioned some ways like a Bay cabinet of how to deal with that. How else? What other strategies do you have dealing with that? So sometimes it's in natural resources. Sometimes health has authority. Water boards might have some different authority. Department of
Yeah.
Environment has a lot of authority. So how does a governor's advisor handle that?
Well, in Maryland, we don't have any silos. We have cylinders of excellence.
Right.
That's the joke. Both Maryland and Arizona and every state, you've got these different delineations, and it's because of the way a law is written and where stakeholders were comfortable. So I would say less formal mechanisms besides a cabinet can often result from specific projects that are being worked on, where the obvious solution between, say, like in Arizona, the Department of Environmental Quality had jurisdiction over water quality and water quality standards, and also permitting for groundwater discharges, but the Department of Water Resources was the very important department to manage water supply and the Colorado River Compact. And we would often work on specific projects together to try to make sure that the left hand and the right hand knew what they were doing. But Bevan, that is, I think, one of the most important aspects of an NGA-led collaboration is for different states to hear how jurisdictions within the governor's administration can work together. I would say it doesn't have to be a cabinet, but a regular meeting and exchanging of information and hot topics. So what you don't want what you don't want is what has happened to me several times, and that is both in Maryland and in Arizona. When you go to a town meeting or town hall meeting or a contentious stakeholder session, and one state agency really doesn't know what the other one is doing, and they're both holding different parts of the same elephant. And so I would say, I know it's a cop-out to say regular communication, but there has to be some really good relationships established between different departments so that they are aware of what the black and white areas of jurisdiction between their agencies are, and what are the gray areas. And then they can, only after they understand that and have good working relationships, can they, usually that knowledge is needed first before they can figure out ways to resolve it. And sometimes the only way to resolve it is to change the regulations or to change a state law. But that's the beauty of working at the state level. You can actually get things done, solutions, once you've identified a problem, usually within a year or so, if there's enough public and political support for it. At the federal level, there's a reason they say it can be as hard as an act of Congress to get a change. But the idea of some type of a formalized or informal cabinet or sub-cabinet. We have sub-cabinets on specific topics that are a priority for the governor. I always think that's a great communicating tool as well. When the Governor Hogan was elected and was filling out his cabinet, he had a specific press conference on his Bay Cabinet appointees. And that just goes to say that in Maryland, the Chesapeake Bay is such an important component of it. I could see a Great Lakes state doing that as well, or another state that has a precious type of water body that they really want to highlight and do it informally or through a more formalized mechanism of a cabinet.
And we've also seen some not permanent cabinets, but temporary task forces convened to deal with the things like the PFAS contamination of drinking water. I know Michigan has a cabinet. Right. I believe Pennsylvania just appointed one. New Jersey has a long-standing water cabinet that looks across a bunch of different sectors to anticipate what the water challenges are going to be there. So
having a sunset established early on in a task force can be a very good thing. Mm-hmm. It can drive harder work and progress towards specific goals, and then maybe so with the Governor Brewer in Arizona, her Blue Ribbon Commission, we had a task force deadline, a sunset, that drove us to issuing the report, and then you can reassess whether or not to continue the task force or shift towards implementation of the recommendations. But sure.
All right. Well, thanks for that broad overview. And sure. Secretary Grumbles will be at our August meeting, and where Governor Hogan will welcome everybody. And so we hope that you all will be there as well. And
absolutely.
All right. Thanks.
Please come.
All right.
Thanks, Bevan.
You're welcome. And I'm going to move on and turn it over to Alan Robertson, who's going to give us a Drinking Water 101 crash course.
Thanks, Bevan, and thanks, Ben, for teeing this up. I'm going to try and give a little more details about the Safe Drinking Water Act, both the legislation and the regulations. Next slide. So my presentation has a few more slides just to provide some of the details. Talk about who our organization is, what we do. Again, a little bit about the legislative history and the summary of the regs, kind of where we are today, both in the legislative side and on the regulatory side. talk about lead and other legacy contaminants. These are ones that have been out here for a while we're still struggling with. And then talk about emerging contaminants with probably the primary focus on PFAS. Next slide. So when I did this slide, I had the hope that we could talk about a potential back-to-back for the capitals. It hasn't worked out that way, but my wife and I did enjoy the experience of going to see the Stanley Cup at the practice facility last summer. Next slide. Evan, can I get the next slide?
Audio.
Can you hear me now?
Just barely.
All right, something happened with, there it is. Is that stronger now?
Yeah, it's a little wobbly sounding though, but just keep talking and I'll call in some tech help.
Yeah, it must be a network issue because is that better? All right, can we go to the next slide? Bevan, I'm not getting the arrows that we had at the bottom in the rehearsal, so I'm going to need you to advance. There we go. So just a little bit about the Safe Drinking Water Act that started off originally in 1974. The idea is to protect the drinking water quality across the U.S. It applies to all waters that are potentially designated or actually used for drinking. And then it authorizes EPA to establish minimum standards to protect the drinking water. And then what happens is states adopt their standards to be at least as strict as the minimum. And then it requires, clearly the owners and operators of the public watersheds to comply with these primary, the health-based standards. There we go. So in 1996, we had some major amendments. Those amendments fundamentally revised the standard setting process. I'll talk about those regulatory processes as well as the 3 criteria for selection of new contaminants to potentially regulate. And as part of that, we also had some new benefit cost considerations. There were some other major provisions. We had a drinking water state revolving fund get involved, comparable to what was in place already under the Clean Water Act, as well as source water protection, consumer conflict reports, and several other major provisions. So the basic framework the SDWA uses is 2-step. You have a maximum contaminant level goal, and that's comparable to a risk assessment process. It's a health-based goal that's set strictly on health effects data. So again, it's not taking cost into considerations, but the EPA policy is to set that at 0 for carcinogens. There's always a lot of debate about science. The SDWA has some pretty clear statutory language to use the best available peer-reviewed science. But again, if you look at that language, it doesn't provide a bright line for what's safe or what's not safe. Next slide. Can I get the next slide? Hey, Bevan, I'm still stuck here on this one slide. There we go. Whoop. Okay, so I'm gonna go back up a couple. There we go. So I talked about the MCLG. The second step is the actual standard, the maximum contaminant level. That's more comparable to risk management. And again, the language in the law says you need to set that as close to the MCLG as is feasible. Again, within that language, you've got to allow an adequate margin of safety. You have to consider the feasibility of the analytical methods and the treatment, and then benefit cost analysis is an important component of the decision making and what the number ought to be. And then EPA also has the ability to set secondary standards for taste and odor and other things that are not health-based. And I don't know what's going on here, but I keep losing these arrows to advance. There we go. A treatment technique can be used in lieu of an MCL. That's primarily where you don't have good methods. EPA is also required to establish a treatment technology for compliance. And again, this is a really complicated process for EPA. They've got to follow several other laws like the Administrative Procedures Act, several executive orders. It's typically a pretty complex process where you have a proposal, then a public comment, and then finally the final regulation. So next slide, there we go. It's coming. So these are the two processes that EPA has. They have to put together a list every 5 years, known as a contaminant candidate list, that's focusing on new contaminants. And then from that, again, on a 5-year cycle, they have to make decisions known as regulatory determinations every 5 years. And again, they'll, if they make a positive determination, that is, to move forward, they will put out the proposed and final rule, going through that public comment period and following those laws that I talked about previously. They also have an interesting requirement from the Safe Drinking Water Act to review all existing regulations every 6 years. And that's really to take into account new data, either new health effects or new methods, and they have to make the determination of whether it makes sense to review that regulation from a national basis and then make the revision, because all the states end up having to revise the rule per the format of the SDWA, where the states have to set standards that are at least as strict as the federal standard. And this is really the key questions that EPA has to answer to be able to move forward with a new regulation. These are the 3 criteria that's in the law. They have to meet all 3 of them. The first one focuses on health effects. The second focuses on occurrence. And the third is the national regulation provides a meaningful opportunity for risk reduction. So again, some of the language here provides for interpretation by the agency. And in fact, number 3, in the law, it says that the decision is in the sole judgment of the administrator. So again, note that this is not a cost-benefit consideration. It's just the criteria to meet to move forward with the proposal and a final regulation. So just to give a quick regulatory history, EPA has been, since the law started in '74, they've been in the process of doing a lot of regulations. They've had 19 major regulations for 91 contaminants. The cost of compliance based on 2013 dollars is about $4 billion a year. They had 9 prior to the 96 amendments, the last set of amendments. And they're more simple regs in the fact that they were primarily numerical MCLs based on an annual average of typically quarterly samples. You had some treatment techniques, but after 96, we've had 10 regulations that address either harder to treat contaminants like arsenic or uranium, or more complicated regulations where it just took more effort by the states to track and follow compliance. And this next slide is just a graphical representation of the number of regulated contaminants in that time frame. So you can see in the 1990s, we had a big increase in the number of regulated contaminants, and then it's flattened out in the last decade, and I'll talk a little more about that later because that creates some issues with public expectations and these emerging contaminants that a lot of states are trying to grapple with. So I have a few slides here that just tee up some policy questions and then allow some time for questions. And these are broad policy questions based on sort of where we are today. And a big one is, what do we regulate next, and how low do we go? We're seeing a lot of the analytical methods now go down to parts per trillion, which didn't exist a decade ago. And the perfluorinated compounds are sort of the poster child for these emerging contaminants now, but there are others like 1,4-dioxane, and there'll be other man-made chemicals. We've also got nitrosamines and other disinfection byproducts. Systems want to maintain a residual disinfectant in the system to protect against microbial intrusion. We've also heard stories about microplastics and neonics. It's a type of pesticide. So the question is, what's our next contaminant of the day? And then, are national standards better than state level standards? You know, what's the balance between having the EPA set standards that all the states have to match and providing state flexibility? And if all the states are setting their own standard, then what's EPA's role supposed to be? In several states, they can't make a move or do anything unless the federal government does, and so they're constrained by those either statutes or policies. And then some states haven't done this before, and so there's a lack of being able to analyze the health effects data and do benefit cost analysis. And then finally, what's the public reception if different states have a standard? If New Jersey has one number and New York has something different, how do they explain that to the constituents in one state when an adjacent state is lower? And again, Ben mentioned this, do we want to set new standards or increase compliance with what we have? EPA has a new breakthrough measure as part of their strategic plan to reduce the number of health-based violations by 25% by 2022. And that sounds like a really good goal. The challenge is we have a lot of small systems with populations of 500 or 1,000 that are creating some of these compliance challenges, and it's not simple to get them back into compliance. They don't have the money, they don't have the expertise, they don't know how to hire a consultant, they don't know how to apply for a state revolving fund loan. So it's really challenging. And then, do we need to take a look at the SDWA with this flattening out of the standards and nothing really coming out of EPA for the last 10 or 15 years? Can we develop a surgical strike to try and maintain the integrity of the standard setting process and yet still speed up the process, make it more efficient, try and optimize it? And who would take the lead on this, and how long might it take? And what do we tell the public in the meantime? And that's becoming a big issue, because the second bullet here is really, I think, becoming a bigger issue. The public is really becoming a driving force. They're not satisfied with this lack of action, and the public now is demanding, is putting pressure on the state legislatures and the regulators to do something. And this is leading to these different states setting different standards. I don't think it's a good thing to have this ambiguity in the numbers where you've got different numbers and different names when you're talking about the same contaminants. And again, I've talked about this before, that states don't have all the skills and knowledge to set their own standards. And so we're trying to work with some, particularly Michigan, to help them move forward in setting standards where they haven't done that in the past. So again, we have these two classes of contaminants. Lead. Lead's a big issue today. We have compliance challenges with the current lead and copper rule. EPA is in the process of finalizing revisions to the lead and copper rule that they're going to propose, I think, in the July timeframe. And that's going to further the compliance challenges because it's a complicated rule and we need to make it better. We need to understand how many lead service lines are out there. We need to have complete distribution system inventories by all the water systems. The states will have to review those. They'll have to adjust the compliance monitoring based on where these lead service lines are. The states will have to review that monitoring. And then ultimately, we'll see a lot of systems having to update their corrosion control treatment. And again, the states will have to review that. We've got others where we've had long-standing compliance problems, arsenic, nitrate, DBPs. I was just at a meeting at EPA yesterday looking at the compliance data for DBPs, and we're finding that in a lot of metro areas, the big systems will sell water to an adjacent suburb, and that adjacent suburb will have compliance problems with DBPs. And how do you make that work between this wholesale retail relationship?
So Alan, I was going to bust in and say, what are DBPs?
Disinfection
I don't know, I'm
byproducts.
sure other people
Yeah,
don't know.
that's good. Thank you. I
Okay.
should have spelled that out. So utilities are required to disinfect to kill bacteria and viruses, and when you do that, you create these byproducts with a naturally occurring carbon, and those are regulated, and you have to comply with the standard for those. There are several standards for those, and that's the challenge. Is that typically, as the water gets moved through the distribution system, the formation of these disinfection byproducts continues, and so the more time it takes, the further it goes out in a metro area, the more disinfection byproducts you see.
Okay.
So thanks, Bevan. I got to tailor mine to the audience here sometimes. So just a couple other things to talk about, and then we'll have a little time for questions. PFAS are sort of the poster child for this big class of emerging contaminants. We're seeing the impacts in almost every state. At our member meeting, we had hands go up. It was probably the mid-30s that are having issues. And how can the states address? Some are setting their standards. Some can't do that. We have collaborated with our colleagues on the clean water side with a project on emerging contaminants, trying to zero in on what states can do in the meantime, and then what we can do as DC organizations to impact what might be done at EPA and on the Hill. And then what's next behind PFAS? Is it 1,4-dioxane or something else? How can we have a strategy for both the federal government and the states to better address these emerging contaminants? If I can get the next slide, I think that's my last slide. And yeah, so here's my contact information, both email and my phone number, as well. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I try and keep up with water news. We also have a Twitter feed for my organization. And with that, Bevan, I'm done, and we can go to questions if we have any.
All right, and if anybody wants to submit questions, just put them in that little box, or send them in the private box that's underneath that. Alan, I have a question for you. So you mentioned the lead and copper rule was going to come out soon. And so how's that going to impact states, and what should governors be thinking about? I'm thinking it's going to create an increased cost of treating and delivering drinking water.
Yeah, I think you're going to see increased cost on two fronts. I think the systems will have an increased cost, particularly on lead service lines, and there's likely going to be some requirement in there for the systems to map out all the lead service lines, in their service area, and then have a plan. And it may be a long-term plan. It could be 20 years, could be shorter, could be longer, to take all those out. And those service lines are typically split between being on public property within the right of way of a street, and then on private property on the building lot. And so the systems have to spend a lot of time and effort to have a joint project to remove those lead service lines, because that's really the long-term solution is to take those lines out while you're doing corrosion control to try and minimize lead leaching. We're also going to
Right.
see
And so,
increased
Alan,
costs in
so
this
lead
area.
service lines, some people might not be familiar with exactly what that is. So can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. Within your home, you've got a bigger main in the street. Typically, it's your water and sewer are under the pavement in the street. You're going to have a small line, a 1-inch line or 3/4-inch line, connects from that main in the street, goes through the building wall, and then feeds the home or building plumbing. And a lot of cases, particularly in the older times, the 30s and 40s and 50s, lead was material of choice. It's very flexible, it's very durable. And so there are a lot of places where they might either have the first couple of feet coming off the main made of lead, or in some cases, that lead service line goes all the way to the building wall, and then you might have a different kind of plumbing inside the house. So they estimate there's about 6 million of these in the country. They vary significantly. How many there are, depending on geography and what the building codes might have been or the plumbing code. But it's a few $1,000s at a minimum to replace it. It can be more in an urban area, but that's going to be a significant cost, as well the cost for the states to do these review activities with the new rule.
So, Alan, it was my understanding that the larger lines, though, the mains are not made out of lead. It's just the connection from the
The
main
connections,
to the home,
yeah.
right?
The
Or
larger
the
lines are typically made out of a ductile iron pipe, and some of the areas out west have gone to plastic and PVC, but it's really just that connection. And in some cases, it's only 20 feet. In some cases, it might be 60 or 80. But in either case, it's still a kind of a disruption to go into a settled area, an urban area, suburban area, and take out those lines and make that replacement of that connection.
Yeah, and so you mentioned some of the other difficulties with the water, drinking water infrastructure in the United States is the size of some of them. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah, you kind of have it going both ways. You have some cases where the system is undersized. They've had more growth, and particularly you're seeing this now in some urban areas where areas are getting revitalized and they're going vertical. So the some of the gentrification and redevelopment, you're seeing more demand from certain areas. In some cases, you're seeing the reverse, where you've had population shifts. You might have had a big user, industrial user, leave the community. The factory's closed. They move to a different location, and then you have stranded investment, where you've got these big lines and not having a demand, and long term that can create water quality problems because water is not being used, it's not being turned over like it should be.
Hmm. And then the whole the broad view of the country was, I think there's like 53,000 public water utilities in the country, community water systems, so that's drinking water systems, and then maybe 16,000 wastewater systems. So,
Yeah, that's a good point, Bevan, and that the way the country developed over time, we had a lot more water systems. So we have, as you said, 53,000 community water systems, but about 30,000 of those serve under 500 people, or under 1,000. It's one of the two. And so you have all these small systems that don't have a big economic base for any kind of rate increases if they have to put in treatment for one of these regulations, or even do the infrastructure replacement to keep up the system over time.
mhm.
And so it's a big challenge, both financial, and then if you even try and give them a loan, it's a hoop for them to go through to fill out the application for a state revolving loan fund loan.
So that just impacts the ability of these drinking water systems to meet all the 90, how many are 91 regulated contaminants there are,
Yeah,
and
it's a real
the
challenge.
infrastructure
Yeah,
challenge
and
too.
some of them even have problems just meeting the most basic ones. And what really pushes them over the edge is when they get hit with one of these more emerging contaminants, be it
Hmm.
an older one like arsenic or nitrate or PFAS. That treatment there, it kind of pushes them over the edge into not being viable in the long term. And
Hmm.
there may be strategies to do shared services or some regionalization with a larger system nearby. But again, there's a lot of institutional barriers to make that work over the long term.
Okay, so Alan, that just tees up another topic about partnerships and consolidation, and those are things that we're going to be looking at throughout the rest of the year in our Water Policy Learning Network, but we're at time now, so we're going to have to let you go. So thank you so much for joining us and giving us that crash course in the Safe Drinking Water Act, sorry.
Yep, you got it.
All right,
Thanks,
so
Bevan.
this is the end of the webinar, and thank you all for joining us. And we're going to sign off now, and we will be sending you information about the August Water Policy Learning Network and inviting you all to that. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thanks.